Today, we look at the first Taiwanese American suburb in the U.S., Monterey Park, which just saw a tragic mass shooting.
We hear from residents of Monterey Park and Half Moon Bay, which also had a mass shooting.
I speak with Rice University racial justice scholar Bianca Mabute-Louie about challenges the Asian American community are facing.
And we share our experience with that first Taiwanese American suburb. This is Taiwan Insider.
Welcome to the show. Today we're going to talk about the first Taiwanese American suburb in the United States, Monterey Park, which was once called Little Taipei.
The suburb was the site of a mass shooting on Lunar New Year's Eve. Let's hear from some of the residents in this report.
On January 21st, a gunman killed 11 people and injured 9 others in a shooting in Monterey Park, California. The victims ranged in age from 57 to 76 years old. The attack took place at a dance studio on Lunar New Year's Eve in a predominantly Asian American community. Monterey Park had been in the middle of hosting a 2-day festival in honor of the Lunar New Year, a major holiday in many Asian countries. Many are now paying their respects to the deceased victims. This shooting is just one example of countless attacks against Asian communities in the United States. To understand the aftermath of the Monterey Park tragedy, Agence France Presse interviewed local residents about their reactions to the shooting and the general trend of crimes against Asian American communities.
She said that it doesn't matter how old they are, it shouldn't be, killing innocent people, and they say they think he's crazy.
I think the fact that it was at a dance studio where it was mainly elders, just enjoying Lunar New Year celebrations and coming together as a community to do something joyous like dancing, and to be gunned down in that situation, and the fact that the gunman himself was an elder, he was 72 years old, it's jarring.
Having grown up in a Chinese American community all my life, these sorts of aunties and uncles are people I would see every weekend, and they remind me ultimately of my own parents who would do similar kinds of dance for church, so this definitely hits very close to home.
Honestly, it's been about 3 years of non-stop attacks against our community, and so whether it's an Asian on Asian crime, or it doesn't matter what the person is at this point, and we do know that they're Asian, but we know that an attack is an attack, and an attack against one is an attack against all of us.
To gain insight into the challenges Asian Americans are facing, I spoke with Rice University racial justice scholar Bianca Mabute-Louie.
She's currently writing a book about Asian American communities in her new book, Unassimilable.
I asked her first what she felt when she heard about the mass shooting.
It was kind of incomprehensible and unbelievable. I mean, there are so many mass shootings that happen now in this country with the gun epidemic that unfortunately, I think for a lot of folks, the first reaction is just kind of being numb. But I think this particular shooting, it was in Monterey Park, which is the first place where my parents ever lived when they came to this country. It was at a ballroom dance studio. And so right in the beginning, I was texting my dad and I was trying to figure out, is this the dance studio that my mom goes to every Saturday? Is it not? It sounds like it's really close. Eventually we found out that, yes, we have family and community members and family friends who attended that dance studio pretty regularly. Yeah, it was incredibly hard because it's my hometown and it's also a protected ethnic community where I grew up. And so there was a lot to process and try to make sense of.
Yeah, I think it really hits home for us who have connections to the community there, right? And many of us do who are Asian Americans. How would you say this tragedy reflects any of the trends in Asian American communities now today? For example, gun ownership has risen over 40% during the pandemic. Mm-hmm. What would you say about some of the trends like that may have been related to this shooting?
At the height of the pandemic, we saw a lot of increase in interpersonal attacks and discrimination towards Asian Americans. And people have theorized that the rise in gun ownership has to do with folks not feeling safe in their own neighborhoods. In terms of how this relates to everything that's been happening in the Asian American community, I mean, I think it adds to the trauma and the precarity and the lack of safety that we have been feeling. And at the same time, there's a lot of details about motives still coming out, but things like domestic violence, patriarchal violence, trauma from displacement, from imperialism, from war, all these things that we carry that are often hidden and not talked about have always been part of our communities, right? And so I think these times of desperation, of isolation from the pandemic, and then this just increased sense of precarity and danger maybe bring some of those things to the surface. And many have said, Min Jo, who is a scholar who has studied the San Gabriel Valley ethnoburg for a long time, talked about how for sure that the gun culture and leniency around gun ownership in this country perhaps emboldens and conditions some of what we saw last weekend.
Oh, yes, it's very unfortunate. It wouldn't have happened in Taiwan, right? Or other places where people don't have access to guns.
Right.
But I did see a statistic actually on your Twitter feed that 55% of Asian American Pacific Islander women are victims of intimate or sexual violence in their lifetime. Can you tell us more about that? Because he had met his ex-wife at the ballroom. How much is gender violence hurting the community?
Well, I think broadly speaking, even not specific to the Asian American community, one fact that we're, I think, just starting to gain more conversation about recently is, you'll have to fact check me, but overwhelmingly mass shootings have some kind of connection to domestic violence, regardless of the race or ethnicity of the perpetrator, regardless of where it happens. There's always some kind of connection, whether it is the act of violence being committed or the perpetrator's personal history. There's always some kind of component of intimate partner and domestic violence wrapped up in this epidemic of mass shootings. And so there's that context to take in mind. And then there's also the reality that, again, gender-based violence and patriarchal violence have been wounds that our community has been carrying for a long time, interpersonally in our own communities, but also thinking about how the Atlanta shooting just 2 years ago targeted Asian women. And when we look at the beginning of Asian folks coming to this country, there was a ban not only on Chinese immigrants with the Chinese Exclusion Act, but before that, there was the Page Act that specifically sexualized and fetishized and criminalized Asian women, barring them from coming into this country. And so in terms of thinking about violence and racial violence, we have to think about it as very intimately connected to patriarchal violence.
What about the issue of Asian hate, which has been a big concern of the Asian American community ever since the pandemic? I was actually in California when this happened. I was on Twitter, and I noticed before people knew who the killer was, they're afraid that it would be a race-based attack, So it seems like the community is very sensitive to any targeting and any violence against Asian Americans. Tell us more about how Asian hate has been affecting the community.
The part about the perpetrator being from our community, I want to specify that it doesn't have to be a white person who's the perpetrator to perpetuate hate against our community, that there is such a thing as intra-ethnic violence, or the violence we do to each other. At the same time, I've been trying recently to move away from the concept and framework of hate and try to understand all the interpersonal attacks of the past few years, as well as the more heinous and violent mass shootings, understand those things as rooted in systemic and state violence, that it isn't just hate, which is something that we imply as interpersonal, right? It is the bias in someone's opinion or in their heart towards a certain group. But actually, these things that we're seeing, the interpersonal attacks, are rooted in what we saw as the systematic scapegoating of Asians for diseases that we saw throughout history, and also most recently in the pandemic. And then the larger scapegoating that we see in this country, for example, the ways that immigrants get scapegoated for unemployment or crime or other social ills. All of these phenomena are forms of state violence. And state violence also includes things like deportation and war and the factors that push people to have to leave their countries to come here. And then to come here and experience things like labor exploitation, and then this culture around gun violence and the leniency around gun ownership. All of these different big social structures that I'm naming are all part of what creates hate. And so when we just limit our conversation to hate, I think that prevents us from, again, seeing the bigger picture that a lot of this is policy-based and structural. And so when we look at the past few years, as well as from this past weekend, all of these things work together.
Well, let's talk more about Monterey Park. I know that you have family there, right? Your grandparents were there, and it's the first Asian American. Also, it's connected to Taiwan too, because a lot of Taiwan immigrants moved there. What was it like for you when you went to Monterey Park growing up?
Yeah, well, I always tell the story of my grandmother there on my mom's side, my popo. She actually immigrated after we did, so she came in her 70s. After she got divorced. She didn't speak English. She didn't really know anyone besides us. She didn't have a car, which if you are familiar with Southern California, very difficult to get around without a car. And so she was kind of set up, under very difficult circumstances with very few safety nets. And yet, I always say the ethnoburb kind of saved her and emboldened her. So in her 70s, into her 80s, she had a pretty thriving social life. She lived on her own in this apartment complex with other Cantonese elders. They gossiped all the time. They played mahjong. They had a Cantonese church that they went to where she got baptized. She had she could walk across the street and go to 85 degrees and get, her morning bow, None of this could have been possible if it weren't for the ethnoburb. And this infrastructure and social safety net that immigrants who had come before us had set up for us and for each other. And so what it was like for me to grow up there, it was a place where, my family rarely, if ever, spoke English. If we were in San Gabriel Valley, we only ate Chinese food, and we got our Chinese groceries, and my parents spoke exclusively Cantonese when we were there. And so I didn't go to school there. I mostly went to predominantly white schools in Pasadena outside of San Gabriel Valley. And so for me, it was really important for me to grow up there where I had this space where I saw Asians didn't need to assimilate and could still thrive and beautiful community with each other.
The whole interview will be up on YouTube and Facebook.
And if you like our content, remember to subscribe and follow below.
Monterey Park was unfortunately not the only site of a mass shooting involving Asian American victims. That same week, up in the San Francisco Bay Area, there was another shooting. We have this report from our partners at Voice of America.
Many Asian Americans in California, already on edge over a wave of hate crimes against their communities, are struggling to celebrate the Lunar New Year and mourn people killed in 2 recent mass shootings.
It's hard to really feel fully present and enjoy the festivity when you know that tragedy has hurt, right, and has impacted the community.
James Zarza-Diaz, who is Filipino and Chinese, grew up in eastern Los Angeles County, where the first shooting happened at a dance hall, killing 11, all Asian American. The suspect shot and killed himself. Hundreds of kilometers north in Half Moon Bay, an idyllic small coastal town with nurseries and restaurants, people were grappling with another mass shooting, killing 7, 5 Chinese nationals and 2 Latinos at 2 Northern California mushroom farms. Police have identified the suspect as a Chinese national, a farm worker at one of those nurseries. Jian Chai, a Chinese American homemaker, has lived in Half Moon Bay for nearly 18 years.
This happened yesterday. My lot of friends said, hey, you should buy the gun. I said, no, I don't like gun. You have the gun, more dangerous, I think.
To have these incidents happen that are impacting, Asian American farm workers here and then 11 Asian Americans down in Los Angeles is really just the worst kind of news that we could ever have.
About 1 in 6 Californians are of Asian descent. In recent years, many of them feel like they're under threat, said California Governor Gavin Newsom at a press conference at Half Moon Bay this week.
I grew up in San Francisco. A third of our population age descent. I live in a state where 27% of us are foreign born, over a third in San Mateo County. What a gift. Majority minority state. But I'm also mindful we saw hate crimes go up 177% against Asians last year. A little more modest in some parts of the country, and we have to do more.
But the most recent shootings are different from the anti-Asian American crimes committed by non-Asian Americans. The 2 suspects in the mass shootings are themselves from the Asian American community. While their motives are still under investigation, some believe mental health could be a factor. Asian American advocates highlight the fact that life in the U.S. for an immigrant can be challenging.
The social and linguistic isolation they may have, the lack of mental health and community support that they need, the easy availability of assault weapons. These trends demonstrate that Asian Americans face a lot of issues as minorities.
For many Asian Americans, this Year of the Rabbit will be remembered as one that has started with tragedy. Some hope this will lead to deeper discussions about the experience of Asian Americans and immigrants who live in the U.S. Michelle Quinn, VOA News, Half Moon Bay, California.
So have you guys ever been to Monterey Park?
Yes.
Well, you're from California, right? So.
Well, I'm not from California, but I lived there for many years in Southern California. And actually, when I was learning Chinese in school in suburban LA, we went on a field trip there.
Really?
Yeah, that was actually the first field trip I ever did when I was learning Chinese in high school.
Really? And what did you think of the place?
At that time, I really didn't know much of the history, but I thought it was very cool because actually growing up in Denver, I'd always loved going to eat like dim sum and going to Chinese supermarkets there. I mean, the community was pretty small there. But then going Monterey Park, yeah, we visited like 99 Ranch and, I think that's also where they had the first like Din Tai Fung, right, or something. I think they put one there.
I don't think so. They probably have one there. I don't think it's
I remember they had just opened one, yeah. So we were like, it was very nice. We had some really nice food and then, it was very cool to see the kind of products and different, cultural businesses, you could say, that were there.
So Asian, right? I mean, when I was growing up, it was the place to go for authentic Chinese food. Actually, the only place outside of Chinatown. So it brings back a lot of memories to talk about Monterey Park. And I think it does play a special role because it kind of started the ethnoburb where these immigrants could really feel at home.
What exactly is an ethnoburb?
Well, I think it's a suburb, actually. So not, as opposed to like Chinatown, which is more urban, where people settle down, they have schools, and the community just sets down its roots there. But they have not totally assimilated to the Western culture, American culture. They keep a lot of their own culture, and they even have Chinese signs, Chinese banks, and at first it was Taiwanese American, and now there are more immigrants from China and different places as well.
Right.
But,
I think it's the refusal to assimilate. That's like a very key characteristic of ethnoburbs. And so I actually often visit my grandparents who currently live in an ethnoburb. So it's called Roland Heights. But actually my grandparents lived in Monterey Park when they first moved from Texas to California. That's where they migrated to because, as Natalie, you said, there's so many stores and a lot of community cohesion in that area. So the story is especially saddening to hear. And yeah, I think there definitely has to be a lot of changes that have to happen. And personally, I think, my grandparents don't speak the most fluent English. And so, being in the US, seeing kind of what's happening with mass shootings in the US, I can also understand how they might find this to be very culturally shocking because this gun issue right now is a very uniquely American issue, this gun mass shooting issue right now. And so I think something has to be done, and maybe it has to be from having more measures to stop these people who are selling guns, because ultimately I think they benefit so much from, the fear that, grows in this community of unsafety, like
That's
not
true.
safety.
I mean, it's crazy how accessible guns are in America, and I think something has to be done about it. I hope people do things about it, people in power.
Yeah, it actually, what you're saying reminds me of this part in the VOA feature that we just saw, where one woman says that her friends are telling her that she has to go out and get a gun to protect herself. So it's kind of interesting how this situation and this event, created out of maybe an atmosphere of fear, and that now it could actually be creating a situation where more events like this could happen if people are really driven to go and purchase more fire weapons.
So I did see a statistic that over 40% growth of ownership of guns among Asian Americans during the pandemic. So that could be because of anxiety, right? Asian hate crimes and the like.
Yeah.
So hopefully we'll be seeing less and less of these crimes. And
I think the timing of it all too, like the Lunar New Year's is supposed to be a time where there's a lot of community coming together to celebrate each other. And so it's unfortunate to hear that people are starting to, fear for their own safety, and especially this time of, celebration, that really, I think, moving forward, I do hope that there's more community cohesion, but that really has to come from kind of a lot of government reworking and some structural policies that are happening to make these changes that I think Bianca mentioned in her interview as well.
That's right. So anyways, the whole interview will be up on social media. And thank you for tuning in to Taiwan Insider. I am Natalie Tso.
And I'm Brendan Wong.
And I'm Itamar Waksman.
And do follow us on social media, subscribe and follow, and write a comment. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, you can follow us on Twitter or Facebook.
And even see all of our videos on YouTube.
We'll see you next time.
All right,
Bye.
Bye.